Thank you very much, and good evening. I come to this series as a professional, as a lawyer, but academically, purely in the formation of a literary scholar, and it's a very distinct formation. It is one which has a very specific pedigree, which has a bearing on my subject this evening. I studied English at Cambridge in the mid-1970s. And that matters because Cambridge was associated, even then, with the intellectual project championed by F.R. Leavis, and it was a particular project which put literary studies, literary criticism, at the very centre of a humanist liberal studies programme. And it wasn't literary studies in some general sense. It was a highly specific conception of what literary studies was about, and it related to a highly specific sense of the appropriate body or canon of literature that should be studied. Leavis played a huge part in defining what became known, and I think still is known, although it now has a kind of slightly fusty, slightly, at any rate, historical character, as Cambridge English. We studied, for example, the English Moralists in the second part of our tripos, as we called it. The English degree was divided into two parts. The first 2 years, it's essentially a run through the literary canon from Chaucer, Middle English, through to contemporary literature, which in the 1970s was essentially Virginia Woolf. And then in the third year, we studied on a much broader range of possibilities the English Moralists, so-called, which was a paper that purported to give a kind of intellectual context to English literature. It was in turn inspired by a colleague of Willie's, a colleague of Leavis's called Willie, Basil Willie. And the idea was that students would have some greater understanding of the centrality of literature by relating literary texts and literary periods to the adjacent intellectual endeavours, essentially of philosophers, but perhaps also of historians, essayists, economists, and so on. By the time I got to Cambridge, the English Moralists paper had become a general philosophy paper, and the connection between the English literary canon and its philosophical context had been lost in favour of a general kind of, for literature students, frolic through the broader Western philosophical tradition, and in fact beyond even the philosophical tradition. When I tell you that I took as my three master thinkers Hegel, Marx, and Freud, you will get a sense that the specifically English connection of the paper had somewhat attenuated. But it was in that kind of milieu, specifically in that milieu, that I first came across Bentham. And I came across Bentham in the context of a foe of literature. Iris Murdoch, writing in the 1970s in a paper called Salvation by Words, describes Bentham plainly and directly as a foe of literature. She identifies a kind of ignominious genealogy, starting with Plato, and in fact characterises Bentham as a kind of, she uses this language, a Puritan, Protestant Puritan enemy of literature, because he associated it with play, and play was something that one should be sceptical of when contemplating life's challenges. So when I went to hear Leavis lecture, and specifically when I heard him talk about the technologico-Benthamite civilization, which his own project of literary studies was designed to challenge, I, so to speak, had already picked up the message, which was that Bentham himself was not to be read. Leavis wrote extensively about the technologico-Benthamite enemy. He wrote about it in the introduction to the volume which was published in 1950 of the Mill's essays, his two remarkable essays on Bentham and Coleridge, in which Mill balances the claims of the two on the modern imagination. He wrote about Bentham again in his book, The Great Tradition. He wrote about Bentham in the context of the attack on utilitarianism that Dickens published under the name of Hard Times. And then he returned to it in a later work, Dickens the Novelist, which he wrote with his wife 20 years later, publishing the same essay on Hard Times, but giving it the subtitle, The World of Bentham. And throughout that period, there was this constant balancing, which led to a constant opposing. The balancing was Mill's, the opposing was Leavis's, of the claims of modern technical, rationalist, capitalist, commercial, instrumentalist, etc., what the Germans called Gesellschaft, modern society, against the pre-industrial communal life, face-to-face contact, all the rest of it, what the Germans called Gemeinschaft. That Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft comparison, which is so value-laden, puts Bentham squarely on the bad side, because these binarisms are never equal. And Mill, as some kind of Olympian figure adjudicating the one against the other, was in the end not good enough for Leavis, as he came down much more powerfully against Bentham, and in favour of a culture which was both lost and also barely prospective in the kind of the virtual community of the English faculty at Cambridge, in which Leavis himself had an only uncertain place. So my sense, if I can be allowed this autobiographical introduction, my sense of Bentham was somebody who was actually, so to speak, only worth studying for the purposes of better understanding the enemy. And it was not until I repudiated my vocation and became a lawyer that I started thinking about Bentham again. And then, of course, it was Bentham in the context of law reform, and in particular his wider project of demystification, his scorn for lawyers, his scorn for the legal aristocracy, his sense of the absurdities and irrationalities of the common law, and so on and so forth, the very familiar Benthamite critique of English law. But it had very little to do with literature. So that's, if you like, a kind of intellectual formation, opening a few words about the place of Bentham in literary critical culture in the 1970s. And I think the truth is that it is pretty much the case now. If you look at a more recent work, if you look at the work of what's called the law and literature movement, which was a movement which came into existence in the United States in opposition to a movement called the law and economics movement, which was about applying quite sophisticated criteria and analytical tools from modern economics to legal analysis. The law and literature movement responded with a counter push, intending to, as they understood it, to humanize law, to disengage law from purely economic considerations, cost-benefit analysis, and all the rest of it. And once again, Bentham, Dickens, was at the centre of that, and in a work, a very important work, early work, in that law and literature movement by Martha Nussbaum, a book called Poetic Justice. She takes quite squarely aim at Bentham utilitarianism she always takes care to say, in its vulgar or rather extreme and impoverished form, and finds in Dickens a satisfactory critique. So what was the case in the 1970s, I think, continues to be the case now. So the question arises, if one asks it from within, so to speak, the literary world, which is where I'm situating myself for the purposes of this lecture, although I'm very happy institutionally to be sitting in the law faculty, that I should be taken for the next 3/4 of an hour as standing inside, so to speak, an English faculty and asking this question. The question is, if it is indeed the case, as I suggest it is, that Bentham is so to speak, nothing more than the enemy of, in the received understanding, the enemy of the literary liberal project, what is there to be said for him? And what is there, just to go back to something I mentioned a few moments ago, what is there conversely to be said by way of demoral, by way of qualification, about Mill? Because just as Leavis deprecated Bentham and endorsed Mill's deprecation of Bentham, so Leavis talked up Mill. Mill famously badly, brilliantly educated by his father, intellectual, emotional crisis. Wordsworth intervenes, discovers the wonder of poetry, distances himself from the Benthamite project to the extent, critically, of introducing notions of taste, rehabilitating, retrieving the value of taste from the Benthamite deprecation of taste in favour of the countering principle of utility, insists upon a distinction between higher and lower pleasures, locates literature in the former category. These thrusts against Benthamite, second-generation Benthamite utilitarianism, undoing the utilitarian project, so it was understood, certainly by Leavis, so that Mill's continuing ostensible allegiance to utilitarianism was then taken to be nothing more than a kind of filial piety. What is there to be said against Mill? And it wasn't in a gesture of ingratiation on my part towards Philip. My first day in the faculty, that I thought, why not think about that? Nor was it a kind of institutional Oedipal attempt on my part to slay the father English department in favour of the, I'm not quite sure what law department, the bride law department. It was instead a sense of an injustice, that it couldn't possibly be the case that there were only good things to say about Mill and there were only bad things to say about Bentham. It offended my sense of complexity. It offended my sense of a kind of my intuition that an injustice was being done, and an overestimation was being made. The one of Bentham, the other of Mill. And this was a sense I had in the context of my own research, which is on censorship of literature and the arts. And so what I want to do is to just talk about Mill and Bentham in the context of censorship. Now, what I'd like to do, and I want to do it in this way, because my project is, at the moment, it stands at about 250,000 words. And I quite understand that this evening I can commit no more than 100,000 words at slow reading to the lecture. Of course, it was a joke. What I'd like to do is I'd just like to identify the propositions which are the architecture of my paper, and then we'll see how we get on. And I will amplify or develop those propositions in the time that's allowed. There are 6 propositions. And of course, then there's a postscript. The first proposition is that Mill had a problem with literary free speech. Literary free speech. Now that's already a somewhat provocative formulation, because Mill, along with Milton, Mill is considered to be the champion, certainly in the Anglophone liberal tradition, of free speech. If free speech is the signature doctrine of liberalism, Mill is the author, so to speak, of that signature. So to say that Mill has a problem with literary free speech is not something that one can assert in the expectation that it will simply be met with a kind of recognition of assent. But that's my first proposition. My second proposition is that Mill's problem has several interesting causes. And those causes are partly biographical, but mostly not. And to the extent that they're biographical in ways that have a kind of resonance. They're not biographical in the sense that one might say they're limitedly biographical, limited to him. My third proposition is that the reasons that Mill had a problem with literature, and Mill's problem with literature, or literary free speech more specifically, this problem and the reasons for this problem were also liberalism's problem, and there were reasons relating to liberalism's own intellectual endeavour. The fourth proposition is that the fact that liberalism is not good on literary free speech is a problem now for us, even though it wasn't a problem in the 19th century and for most of the 20th century. And I want to explain why, but it has a great deal to do with events in 1989, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the issue of the fatwa, when suddenly one system of literary censorship collapses. It's a system which, in the liberal West, stands against liberalism, and in relation to which liberalism defines itself. We are the place of free speech. And with the fatwa, there is a radical reorganizing of the vocabulary of censorship, so that it's no longer possible to say that censorship is something that happens somewhere else, and instead becomes an issue that we here have to address. And we have not been addressing it as we should be, and part of the reason for that is because we have an inadequate liberal tradition on which to draw, and that inadequate liberal tradition starts with Mill's silence on literary free speech in On Liberty. The fifth proposition is that there are things that liberals need to do to fix this problem, to ensure that a more adequate response to the challenges of new censorship of literature can be made. And the sixth proposition, which is a kind of elaboration of the fifth proposition, so perhaps it's 5.2, is that liberals need to distance themselves from Mill and get closer to Bentham. So, in a sense, that's the whole lecture. And the postscript is a kind of curiosity because it asks the question, given that Mill was so tough on Bentham on literature, Mill says, for Bentham, poetry is a matter of misrepresentation. For Bentham, poetry is no better than pushpin, which, according to Frederick Rosen, at any rate, is like billiards. I never myself quite understood what pushpin was and why. I mean, obviously, the Benthamites were known. But in any event, a trivial game. The idea, by the way, that Bentham was a kind of Philistine and not interested in literature doesn't survive consideration of the alliterative properties of that sentence in which poetry and pushpin are balanced so beautifully. But the question is, in the postscript, given that Mill was so down on Bentham, precisely on the question of literature, why is it that didn't lead Mill to actually writing anything interesting or useful or helpful on the subject of literary free speech? Indeed, I think, oddly, counterintuitively, it pushed him even further away. So anyway, that's the lecture. That's the text. The rest is commentary. Let me go back to Proposition 1. Mill had a problem with literary free speech. So, I mean, as we all know, On Liberty, it marked the moment of publication of On Liberty in 1859, marked the moment of Mill's greatest intellectual ascendancy in Victorian political intellectual culture. Mill actually finished drafting it in 1857. And 1857 is an extremely important year if one is interested, as I am, and as I would like more people to be, in the censorship of literature. Because it was in 1857 that the first Obscene Publications Act was passed in this country, Lord Campbell's Act, as it was called. It was in 1857 that Flaubert in Paris was prosecuted for Madame Bovary. It was in 1857 that Baudelaire was prosecuted for his volume of poetry, Flowers of Evil, Fleur de Mal. It was in 1857 that Herman Melville, gave up writing novels on the publication of his novel The Confidence Man, writing to his fellow novelist Hawthorne and saying, I've come to the conclusion that we are living in a culture, in a time, where if it doesn't pay, it's banned. So he raises the question not of state censorship, he raises the question of commercial censorship. He raises the capitalism question in the context of literary censorship. 1857 is the year in which Ruskin publishes a book on drawing, in which he makes recommendations to young people on what they should and shouldn't read. 1857 is also the year in which the very eminent medical authority, William Acton, publishes an anti-masturbation treatise in which he warns about the risks to young men of reading works of literature. In 1857, a new examiner of plays is appointed with supervisory control over all new drama that goes on the London stage. In 1857, the photographer Roylander attempts to display a work in Manchester Gallery. It's a tableau, and he is prevented. And so on. Actually, there's more. It is the most extraordinary year. I mean, it's the most extraordinarily bleak year. Marx finishes the drafting of the Grundrisse, which is, till the early part of the 20th century, was unpublished and constituted a tremendous manuscript precursor to Capital. And in that work, he addresses the question, why is it, if we're to understand that the way in which the world works is on a base superstructure model, where in effect the superstructure in which is included law, the arts, and so on, is merely a reflection of what's going on in the base. Why is it that we still take pleasure from Greek tragedy? It's a puzzle for him. What is it, he asks himself, that can be said about literature in the context of my inquiry? And when he comes 2 years later to write his contribution to the critique of political economy, which is one of the few works he publishes, that section drops out because he cannot address it. Literature drops out as an unsolved problem in the very year in which Mill, and this is my first point, this is my first proposition, fails to address in his work on liberty any of the events of literary censorship that took place in that year. And it should not be thought that his silence is because he was operating at so lofty a conceptual level that he didn't concern himself with local, so to speak, newspaper-type events. In chapter 2 on liberty, he condescends to talk about 3 cases, 3 litigated cases, in which the religious freedom of a party, in each case to the case, was infringed. 2 jurors and a defendant, because of their refusal to take the oath on the bar. It mattered to him. He read the papers. He was, of course, also a tremendous Francophile, followed events in France very closely. The Flaubert trial was covered in the press, in the journals. His intellectual nemesis, Fitzjames Stephen, wrote about the Madame Bovary trial. And yet he says nothing on liberty. Now, why is it? We all know the standard criticisms on liberty. We know the first criticism is it's just an intellectual mess. We know that it's a first-year undergraduate exercise to identify how on liberty just kind of implodes. The harm principle is capable of such general application. There is nothing left that, so to speak, can be permitted. The way I put it is the concept of self-regarding conduct contracts in meaning and hemorrhages content. By the end of the essay, the territory it occupies has shrunk to unsustainable dimensions, whereas harm itself expands. The concept of harm expands in meaning and draws in content. One is accountable to society for other regarding actions. This accounting properly results in sanctions if the action harms others. The line between censure and coercion is blurred. Mill isn't quite sure where censure, properly understood and in the proper exercise of our own freedom, ends, and a kind of shame-inducing, coercive, influencing, or cramping of the freedom of others begins. It's a mess. I mean, it's an inspiring, remarkable mess that we should all read and reread, but it is a mess. And of course, we're also familiar with the second objection to On Liberty, which is that it is remarkably illiberal. We know that it's illiberal about children. We know that it's illiberal about barbarians. We know that it's illiberal about people with low tastes. But what has not been addressed, so far as I'm aware, in the literature on Mill, because in a way it's not there, and one would have to do that thing which is not done in legal studies, although of course it's done all the time in literary studies. One would have to interrogate not a presence but an absence. What has not been done is to ask the question, as if one was Sherlock Holmes listening out for the dog that didn't bark in the night. Why is On Liberty silent on the Obscene Publications Act? Why is it silent on Flaubert? Why is it silent on Baudelaire? The silence of Mill on the literary censorship scandals of the year in which he wrote it, and by the way, let it not be thought that because these events were contemporaneous with his own writing, he just didn't have time, so to speak, to take them into account, because it was only 2 years after he finished that he published. I think there's a connection, if I can jump from Proposition 1 to Proposition 4, between the failure of Mill to address the events of literary censorship in 1857, with the failure of liberalism to address the censorship event of 1989, the fatwa against Salman Rushdie. We did not then have an adequate vocabulary in which to address that censorship event, just as Mill found himself unable, if he tried at all, and I'll speak in a moment about whether in fact he did, to address the censorship events of 1857. That double failure is, I think, properly to be understood as not a personal failure of Mill's or a personal failure of liberals in 1989. Joseph Raz has some very interesting things to say about the impact on liberals in 89, 90 of the fatwa, the legal philosopher Joseph Raz. And he talks about it in terms of bemusement, of a challenge which had a kind of monumentality about it. Well, one stood in front of it and one felt incapacitated by it. Not just because it was menacing and frightening, and those of you here who have the years to remember, there was anxiety about going into bookshops that stocked the Satanic Verses, because bookshops were firebombed. People died in riots. Assassination attempts were undertaken over a book. And that anxiety, that fear for personal safety was unalleviated by any confident moral intellectual grasp of the dimensions of the challenge, because in addition to the fear came the sense that the vocabulary wasn't available to negotiate the fear through to a position of stable certainty. Should we privilege freedom of religion over freedom of speech? Was Rushdie's book to be regarded as political speech? Was it to be regarded as dissenting religious speech? What sense do we make of a novel if we don't have the language as liberals to think about it as a novel? And the silence of the Anglophone liberal tradition on literature meant that in 1989 we could not find the speech to address the Rushdie event, the Rushdie affair, in a way that would have fortified us and given us some greater resolve. That is the beginning of the case against Mill. It was a kind of self-laming. Of course, it's not just a case against Mill. And it's not a perversity on Mill's part. It's the explanations, and here I'm moving to proposition 2. The explanations are deep in liberal political culture. There is the association of a certain kind of progressivism in the 19th century with a kind of high-toned moral culture, which so to speak, deplores any reference to, any consideration of sexual matters. And in the debates in the House of Lords on the 1857 Act, Lord Campbell was very strong on this. It was the low trade in pornographic material, instruments, images, engravings, and all the rest of it that was under attack, not the kinds of materials that one would find in a gentleman's library. It's a heavily class-conditioned distinction that was made, but it found common cause with the progressive political perspective, which was essentially one of a kind of moral elevatedness, a moral energy, a commitment to triumphing over everything that was ignominious and base and sordid and material and so on and so forth. And you find that very, very compellingly in Mill. If you look at On Liberty, you will find not just then a silence about literature, you will find positive arguments in favour of literary censorship. In Mill's deprecation of lowness, or what he calls lowness or deprivation of taste, and even more importantly, in Mill's animadversions against offences against decency. The sense in which liberalism in the 19th century, with its signature doctrine of free speech, focuses on religious freedom and the conditions for political participation, which then works through, particularly in the American liberal political tradition, conditioned by First Amendment jurisprudence, to an understanding that free speech is all about providing the necessary conditions for a free people to deliberate and make decisions in a so to speak, an open and unconstrained way. So that free speech is all about politics, just as perhaps in the 17th and 18th century it was all about religion. that sense in which the 16th and the 17th century, the 18th through to the 19th century, then into the 20th century, that whole liberal trajectory in which religious free speech segues into political free speech, and literature doesn't get a look in, this also informs Mill's silence. So, what can we say about Bentham? Because this is, after all, a series on Bentham. I spent a long time talking about Mill. I spent very little time talking about Bentham. And I'm not going to be able to redress any balance by talking about Bentham at any length, just because time doesn't allow it. But let me say this about Bentham. Having, I think, done something to substantiate the argument that Mill is not quite the, so to speak, Leavisite pin-up boy that he was, so to speak, in the tradition he is considered to be. What case can be made for Bentham? I think what one has to do is to say the following. I think it comes down in general terms to 2 points, and then one can elaborate on those points. I think the first point to make is that there is a Bentham aesthetic. And the second point to make is that Bentham makes destructive interventions in received aesthetic understanding, which themselves are internal to aesthetics. It's a curious thing, because in the English philosophical tradition, in the British empirical tradition, there is no work of aesthetics. Aesthetics is the absent subject. There is no Lockean aesthetic. There is no Humean. There are essays of Hume. But there is no Humean aesthetic. If one wants to understand aesthetics as an integrated component of a broader philosophical tradition, one has to go essentially to Germany. It is in German idealism that one, so to speak, can grapple with the aesthetic as an integral component of the broadest possible understanding of the world and the way in which the human subject is properly to be oriented in relation to it. What Bentham does is he breaks out of this rather complacent disregard for the aesthetic, and he attacks it. That's what I mean by the destructive nature of his interventions. So, for example, his conception of sinister interests. Why was it, Bentham asked himself, that the perfectly reasonable reforms that he proposed were being resisted? Why weren't they taken on board by sensible, intelligent people who, at any rate, held themselves out as being concerned only for the good of the community? He came to the conclusion that it was because their interests, their sinister interests, actually made them inaccessible to reason. And then he began a kind of a proto-sociology of aristocracies, among which he identified the literary aristocracy. They were part of this constellation of sinister interests. I find that a fascinating conception of the way in which literature is productively, collectively organised, a way of thinking about the writing of literature, a way of thinking about the antagonistic, when not, more interestingly, agonistic relation between literature and, so to speak, society in general. Let me offer a series of propositions in relation to Bentham's aesthetics. The first is that Bentham's hedonism, the way he puts pleasure on the table, so to speak, is absolutely fundamental to any modern conception of the aesthetic. Leavis was too strenuously moralizing in the case he made for literature to actually allow for the possibility that the literary gave one pleasure. The challenge of pleasure and the place of pleasure in the aesthetic is one that was raised perhaps first certainly in modern times, as late as the 1960s and 1970s in France. It is to the work of Roland Barthes that one has to go in that long march from Bentham's understanding of pleasure and pain before one gets any kind of properly developed and, in Barthes' case, highly provocative understanding of the absolutely central place that pleasure, which itself is to be interrogated, the central place that pleasure has in the aesthetic. Now, if we want to find an Anglophone reference point, if one wants to begin to construct, so to speak, a liberal aesthetic from inside a liberal political intellectual tradition, it is to Bentham that one has to go for this understanding of pleasure, just as it is to Bentham that we have to go if we want to understand the nature of artistic production, the nature of artistic creation as something other than this kind of romantic, rather tired notion of the artist as the solitary genius. Against the literary aristocracy, we place the solitary genius. Now, we may say, well, it's just two sides of the same coin. The one is an impossibly elevated conception. The other is a deliberately comic, base response to it. And that what we need to do is to break out of the kind of the dialectic, or the first two terms of the dialectic. But you need to instantiate the antithesis before you can get to any kind of adequate synthesis. And it's only in Bentham that you get the antithesis of this romantic conception, which of course was the very intellectual context in which he was writing and working, the romantic context. One has to understand him as an anti-romantic, answering the romantic ideology of the solitary artist. This is a very, very, within literary history, this is a very recognizable move, except that outside literary history, it's not understood, it's not seen. So that in moments of particular elevation, when the most extravagant claims are being made on behalf of literature, someone somewhere blows a raspberry. I mean, a perfect reference point for this is in 1930s France, inside Surrealism, with its kind of neo-romantic advocacy of the artist as a kind of seer, with its privileging of automatic writing, its liberating of the unconscious, a kind of a sort of it's a kind of conception of art which you find in the Aeon, in Plato. And against that, the so to speak, the Bentham figure, the raspberry blowing Bentham figure, is Bataille, who celebrates the pornographic, the formless, the ignominious, the base, who starts a magazine and puts on the front cover a picture of a toenail which is slightly ingrown. Something so gross, something so repellent, and yet so trivial that one can't look at it and, so to speak, continue to nurse the illusions that we are nothing other than spirit. What I want to say is that Bataille was the Bentham of 1930s France. I don't want to push the analogy for those of you who are inward with Bataille. I think it probably doesn't go further than I've just stated it, but it is there. It's 7:05. I think I need to end in a kind of slightly ramshackle way. Let me just say this. It seems to me that the case that needs to be made for literary free speech, for free speech for artists, is a case that has yet fully to be elaborated. And I think the work in elaborating it has to begin in several places, but one of those places is in the deprecation of Mill and the elevation of Bentham.